Dear friends, my name is Fritz and I will serve as a moderator for this session at Gone Digital. I'm finishing my PhD at the University of Iceland. In my dissertation, I discussed the state of preaching and pastors working in a digital world of theology. I hope you have had the opportunity to read those interesting papers from Katherine, Schmidt and Pryor. They will give us 10 minutes summary of their papers each, and then we will have 5 minutes response to each paper, and after that we will have general discussions. Our first speaker today will be Katherine Schmidt, Assistant Professor of Theology at Molloy College in New York. Her book Virtual Communion is from Fortress Academic, and she will present her paper, Inevitable Hybridity, Digital and Technological Paradigms for Revisioning Theology. Her paper explores the category of hybridity and even high-flex educational models from a theological perspective. Her respondent is Deanna Thompson, Director of the Lutheran Center for Faith, Values and Community, and Marty, Regent Chair in Religion and Academy Thompson's work at St. Olaf's, focuses on advancing the mission and programming of the Lutheran Center and promoting interfaith dialogue both with and beyond St. Olaf. Our second speaker is Pryor, who is currently Vice President for Academic and Student Affairs and Associate Professor of Religion at Bethany College in Lynchburg, KS. His primary research interests include science and theology, gender studies, feminist theologies, comparative theology, contemporary Lutheran theology, and phenomenology. In his paper, Theological Infrastructure from Analog to Digital, relying on a theo-phenomenological account of the flesh as understood in light of an analysis of wonder and the uncanny. This paper examines how the digitality of theology reframes our understanding of the stranger who is to be treated as our neighbor. The respondent to Pryor's paper is Max Thornton, PhD candidate, Theological and Philosophical Studies in Religion at Drew University with an interest in disability, queerness, gender, and technology. And before we start, I am going to present to you a few house rules we use during the session. Participants are to stay muted until they have been acknowledged to speak. When you want to speak, use the raise hand feature in Zoom. Eliminate distractions so you can focus on the speakers. Use your full name in the participant list so that the coordinators can track attendance. The chat feature should be used to share additional resources and information, but not to engage in side discussions. Participants who wish to type their questions may use a chat box with a preface question. All session will be recorded. Delegates can send requests to the conference organizers to have comments deleted from recording. And I want to point out that the Twitter handle of the conference is #GoneDigital2021. And then I want to welcome Katherine Schmidt with her paper, Inevitable Hybridity, Digital and Technological Paradigms for Revisioning Theology. Katherine, over to you.
Thank you so much, Fritz, for moderating for us. Thank you so much to Deanna for agreeing to respond to my paper. And thanks to the organizers for this conference, especially putting the times of other places in the world. I think they got tired of me showing up late to things, so they made sure to put New York on there, because they all know my math is terrible. All right, so I just want to give you a sort of brief summary of my paper. And the title of it is Inevitable Hybridity, and the subtitle is less interesting. So you can read that on your own if you'd like. So I've been studying the category of the virtual for the past decade or so, from a theological perspective. And I thought that for our meeting this week, I would play with another category from the digital context, and that is hybridity. I think that a couple of things got me thinking about this: notions and negotiations of hybrid church coming out of the pandemic, which I know many of you have experience with pastorally and theologically. And then also my experience as an educator navigating so-called hybrid and high flex educational contexts. So I make the claim here that I want to think about hybridity as inevitable for the church for two reasons. The first is theological, and the second is sort of cultural historical. I think the first one is actually a more difficult claim, more of a conceptual leap than the second. So I want to say something about that first, and then go into thinking about different models of hybridity and what they could maybe offer the church. So from a theological point of view, I argue that there's a way in which we can understand hybridity as being a persistent theme or category for the church, all the way back to the Hebrew Bible. And so I suggest that there's a way in which, as chosen people, as a people set apart, but also in the world, the people of Israel could be understood using this category of hybrid. Also kind of thinking about the ways in which, because of the reality, the persistent reality of diaspora for the people of Israel, there may be a way in which to understand their history as necessarily hybrid. From the New Testament perspective, I point to the ways in which the New Testament picks up this notion of the chosen people. And I say that there's a way to understand the church as in this sort of eschatological suspension, between the already and the not yet. And then the third theological point that I make, and I put this as a question, actually, not as a hard and fast argument. Is there a way in which we can understand the incarnation as hybrid? On the one hand, as we think about sort of everyday uses of the word hybrid, it might seem heretical at first to think about it in terms of a hybrid, insofar as it kind of runs counter to the Chalcedonian definition of Christ as both fully human and fully divine. But in some of the models of hybridity that I'm going to present in a moment, I think that there are ways in which we might be able to understand the incarnation as hybrid, and ways in which that might be helpful for us. So basically thinking of, using a category that we use all the time in our sort of digital context and our educational context to really kind of reframe and re-understand Revelation. So the three major models of hybridity that I wanted to look at, and this is mostly following current discourse from cultural studies, from media studies, from other people who are interested in this category. And I enter into this conversation very humbly as a theologian who is kind of borrowing this. The three that I found most interesting were the biological model, the cultural model, and the linguistic model. And as you might imagine, these are not necessarily always so discrete. So the cultural and linguistic have a lot of overlap, for example. So the biological model is the one that comes to mind for me when I first think about hybrid. I think the first time that I heard about hybrid was as a little girl learning about plants and you know, the sort of the biology of it. And so if we look at the etymology of the word hybrid, the Latin hybrida is a product of a tame sow and a wild boar. And so you see the biological here. But what I want to point out is what I've underlined, which is that the tame and the wild part, which are cultural categories, right? They're not necessarily biologically marked. They're actually something that shows sort of human interaction or interaction with culture. But I wanted to kind of focus on this model for a moment, because often when we think about the hybrid, we carry into our conversations an assumption of a kind of muddying of the waters, if you will, so that, you know, when you bring two things together, what you end up with is some sort of compromise or some sort of denigration of one of these two pure antecedents. So if you think, for example, about the common example of a horse and a donkey creating a mule, which is often sterile, that's, I think, what a lot of people carry into this conversation of the hybrid. And so the biological has, as a metaphor for hybridity, you know, some helpful elements, but, you know, there's some limitations to this as well. The other important thing to mention about the biological model is that, unfortunately, this model of hybridity gets carried into 18th and 19th century scientific racism. And this is, you know, particularly, this is culturally particular to the United States and to Europe, I think, predominantly. But this notion that, you know, there's a certain anxiety over race mixing that gets put into kind of colonialism and understandings of the nation state in the 19th century, especially. So I kind of, you know, kind of bracket the biological for some of those concerns, and I'll say more about the concerns in a second. I'm more interested in the way that cultural studies use the notion of hybridity and kind of recognizing, again, diaspora and recognizing the necessary sort of hybridity of many cultural identities, right? And what I like about this is that it pushes against that notion that there's a sort of pure one and a pure number two, and they make this sort of impure third thing. The cultural model really reminds us that things are always in flux. They are always hybrids themselves and creating sort of new products. So I really appreciate that from the cultural model. Even more so is the linguistic, right? So I draw here on the work of Umberto Eco, who talks about his experiences in translation and argues that language is always culturally constructed, and that when we go to translate things, we imagine language as a sort of fixed thing that we kind of go one-to-one. But anybody who's translated knows that that's not actually how translation works. And so some of these models of cultural and linguistic hybridity actually, I think, are much better for the theological project. So what are some of the takeaways of these models? So again, I think the danger from the biological model is importing anxieties or assumptions from scientific racism. And that would predominantly be, obviously, the racist point of view, but also this notion of sort of two pure antecedents and then a third product that is somehow impure. So the illusion of a pure antecedent. From a church's perspective, what I appreciate about this is that as we engage with kind of what we assume about hybridity, this can help us resist what I would call sort of golden age thinking, right? The idea that there are there's a golden age to the church that we just need to kind of return to. So this hybridity makes us think about process, right? Hybridity is process, dynamism, but at the same time, realizing that dynamism is something that transcends history, that everything is always in process. And so when we think about the Pilgrim Church, how do we think about that in the new context of the digital? The last thing I'll say is that I also include what I would call sort of other more familiar models, which would be the automotive understanding of hybridity, and I can say something about that in the Q&A, and the educational. So what can we take away from these? So the automotive, I think, is particularly interesting because instead of thinking about two antecedents that then create a third thing that is somehow lacking, I do think that there is something in the imagination of the hybrid automotive that sees two things coming together to create something new and actually kind of beyond what those two things were. I guess I'll kind of stop there and say that I think the sort of the heart of the paper are these kind of takeaways, and the title itself is really about the ways in which the church is already hybridized and has been for a very long time, insofar as it has this sort of theological underpinnings, but also the ways in which digital technology is inseparable from the church, and thus kind of leads to a sort of hybrid status for the church. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katherine. And then it's a respondent, Deanna Thompson. Deanna, welcome.
Thanks very much, Fritz. And I really appreciate the opportunity to respond to Katherine's paper on inevitable hybridity. She gave a thoughtful response to my book on the virtual body of Christ when it was released in 2016 with the help of Stephen Oakey, who I see on this call as well, and the Online Forums Syndicate. So I'm delighted to get to continue the conversation about what it means to be the church in the digital age and how digital technology and our thinking about that might impact our thinking theologically. So the time for response is short, but I'll limit my comments to 3 points that I appreciated about the paper and 3 prompts to consider as this project continues to develop and unfold. So first, the appreciations. 1, I appreciated the emphasis on the inevitability of hybridity in ways that debunk the notion of a pure or a static form of education or church. Our digital tools are just the latest versions of technologies of communications that we've used for centuries to educate and to be church together. 2, I think it's important and helpful to name the legacies of the problematic usage and deployment of the term hybridity. And Katherine, you do so in a way that doesn't look away from those harmful constructions, while at the same time making the case for its continued usage because of precisely the inevitability of hybridity in tradition, in language, in education, in the church, and beyond. 3rd, your point that hybridity produces something new, I think is really effectively explained, especially through the innovative use of the automobile hybridity illustration, and then applied in a provocative way to the incarnation. That Jesus, the Christ, is simultaneously God and human, 2 natures, 1 person, something new. So a few prompts. First, even as I appreciated the setting of the context regarding hybridity, acknowledging its etymology that predates digital technology, I craved a definition of hybridity at the very outset to guide the early claims that Israel and the church can both serve as illustrations of hybridity. So if you were to use a succinct definition of hybridity right at the outset, I'm curious what that would be. Second, when teaching about Christianity's place among the religions, I've often used Catholic feminist theologian Janine Hill Fletcher's chapter, "We Are All Hybrids," from her book, Monopoly of Salvation, A Feminist Approach to Religious Pluralism. Being in conversation with Hill Fletcher in a few select places could deepen and enhance your argument about the church always being hybrid, such as her claim that studying the context of the ancient church leads to the conclusion that Christian identity has been shaped in response to the lived encounter with religious others. Just as you say in your paper, Christian tradition has been from the beginning shaped by multiple streams of influence. Third, proposing that we think of incarnation as the key theological illustration of hybridity leads me to wonder about how such a claim might disrupt Chalcedonian claims of no mixing, no confusion between human and divine. In the chapter, "We Are All Hybrids," Hill Fletcher references anthropologist Benson Saylor's work, suggesting that hybridity encourages us to see the boundaries of categorization as permeable rather than clearly delimited. If we continue this line of thinking, how might the permeability of hybridity impact how we think and talk about the divine and human coming together in incarnation in Israel or the church? I wonder if stressing the permeability of hybridity might help ecclesial communities more easily or fully embrace the ways in which digital technologies are enhancing what it means to be the body of Christ today. For instance, digital technology opens up possibilities to have the universal permeate the local. My local church has been connecting via Zoom with one of our church partners in Guatemala, worshiping and praying together through digital technology. And if we take this emphasis on permeability with us into the project of revisioning theology, as you encourage, I would love to see how the concept of permeability might impact our incarnational thinking. How might taking the divine permeating the human and the human permeating the divine in and through Christ help us better understand the possibilities of being the body of Christ in our digital age? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Deanna, for your response. And then it's then we will have Adam Pryor with his theological infrastructure from analog to digital. Adam Pryor, over to you.
Thanks so much. It's a delight to be here. I'm really glad that we have this opportunity to gather. And I will start with an apology to Max, who got a meandering paper very late. So I am confident he will make me look better than I should. And I am deeply appreciative of that from the outset. The paper really aims to do two things. The first aspect of the paper is really about thinking about the structure of digital theology as a distinctive form of constructive theology. And so it tries to situate reflections on that in light of the categories that I use most often as a theologian, thinking in terms of a correlational theology and thinking in terms of the ontological significance of phenomenological reflections. I mentioned that at the outset because the idea is that this is a proof of concept, and you could apply any set of ontological categories in any structure of constructive theology, put them in conversation with one another, and I hope some of the questions that get provoked, particularly at the beginning and the end of the paper, would shape the way that that occurs. The other aim for me in writing the paper was to think very explicitly about the ways in which digital technologies supervene on analogical properties, which is specifically to think about the ways in which the digital is an infrastructural technology. So in essence, this came to me as I was reflecting on an experience of a student conduct situation. And the other side of my job that I do when I don't get to teach, I'm dealing with the inane things that US college students do. And in one of these cases, it was dealing with speech that was online and the ways in which that speech could or could not disrupt the physical community. What was fascinating to me as I was dealing with this case over the course of the past year was really that as soon as the speech was removed, and it could be forgotten in some ways, the way in which various participants and actors in the particular situation engaged with one another changed. And that was what got me thinking about this way in which it's all too easy to forget in the midst of the ways in which digital technologies facilitate new communications and new properties, that they are reliant on a certain analogical set of infrastructures that must be present in order for them to work the way that they do. So keeping that in mind, what I was really interested in and remain interested in is this disjuncture, this sort of distinctive way in which digital phenomena can or can't open new and emergent ways of being in the world. And what I'm interested in are those distinctive moments for digital experiences, not where digital experiences are enhancing or extending something that can already be well described in terms of various analogical counterparts, but places where a new approach to the way in which things take on ontological categories is opened by particular organizations of preceding levels or preceding dimensions of the way we experience the world. A way of thinking about that, and the way that I usually work with it with students, is to talk about this sort of classic distinction that we make between a change in kind and a change in degree. So when I'm thinking about digital theology and I'm thinking about the direction that digital theology goes, what I'm particularly interested in are changes in kind, not necessarily the ways in which digital experiences enhance or diminish various degrees of otherwise analogical experiences. Outlining those questions to me is very interesting for digital theology, because I believe that, very importantly for an emergent form of constructive theology, articulating the ways in which the digital experiences that we describe are or are not consistent with the analogical counterparts that underpin them will be essential to making clarity for any sort of systematic or constructive claims going forward. That's at the outset what I want the paper to do. The rest of the paper that deals with things like the flesh, wonder, the uncanny, the neighbor, the experience of forgiveness is really the goal is to be proof of concept for these wider methodological questions that I hope underpin the ways in which digital theology sets itself up as a field going forward. So the experiment in the paper, which is really the second part of it in a lot of ways, works with categories that were simply familiar and helpful to me. I use the phenomenological notion of the flesh as a way of articulating a flexible ontology, looking at the ways in which various technologies intersect with and are incorporated to bodies. The suggestion that I want to make is that digital flesh could be a distinctive category, that the ways in which digital technologies incorporate to the body are so distinctive as not to be reducible in every instance to the ways in which other more physical and tactile technologies are introduced and incorporated to the body. I use the notion of wonder and the notion of the uncanny as phenomenological feelings that accompany experiences and indicate a place where this sort of ontological discrepancy may exist, which is to say, in those moments where we take on some aspect of the digital into our flesh and we experience something alienating or disorienting, those are the sorts of experiences that I think we need to pay attention to most in constructing a digital theology. And last but not least is then to look at this notion of forgiveness. And I use Kierkegaard's notion of forgiveness as a place to begin, just because it's classic and kind of easy. I think it's a little bit easier to get a hold of. There are some very clear categories that he uses. But for Kierkegaard, right, forgiveness really entails two moments that are inverse to one another, one of remembering and one of forgetting. And what I suggest at the end of the paper is that the way that he figures forgiveness relies on a certain way of spatially, temporally, and causally being in the world that doesn't apply well in every digital context. And if it doesn't apply well, then one, we probably shouldn't use Kierkegaard for digital accounts of forgiveness. But two, I think more interestingly, what it opens up is a question of, are there any accounts of Christian forgiveness that sufficiently deal with the ways, particularly the temporal notions of digital flesh, don't line up with the physical ways of being with each other as the temporal experiences of physically being with one another. That, to me, is interesting because it opens a place for a constructive digital theology that looks different, that requires a different account of forgiveness than we might otherwise use when we're physically together. That's the sort of broad overview of the paper. No one ever complains when you're a little short instead of long, so I hope that will be okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Adam. I was just going to give you the 2 minutes notice, so you're perfect. And then I welcome Max Thornton. Max.
Thank you, Fritz. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, organizers. I realize I need to update my biographical information because I just graduated from my doctoral program, but that's neither here nor there. Yeah, I thought this paper was great. I had like a million thoughts in response to it, but I tried to keep it down because this is only a short response. So I will try not to go on for too long, but I do have plenty more to say about it. So Pryor has given us a rich and evocative proposal for how to do digital theology. As I may quote your introductory paragraphs, you're suggesting, quote, that the most interesting forms of a digital theology emerge where digital technologies change the way we experience space, time, causality, and substance, creating a distinct set of lived experiences in a digital dimension, irreducible to our everyday experience of these ontological categories. Analyzing technology through the phenomenological category of flesh, he describes the disorientation of these changed experiences as producing a sense of wonder or the uncanny, which demands a theological response adequate to the profound nature of the change. So how does our fleshly engagement with digital technologies produce such a disorienting sense of wonder? Pryor uses the example of the bicycle to vividly illustrate his phenomenological account of flesh and technology, describing the fluidity of sensing and being sensed, and the shifting horizons of differentiation between self and the world. At times, he feels the distinction lying between his own body and the bike. At other times, the distinction relocates to differentiate between the bike body, as he calls it, and the world. This is a beautifully clear demonstration of the dynamic entanglements that constitute our being in the world, and one answer to the question Jane Bennett poses in her book, Vibrant Matter. How can I start to feel myself as not only human? That is, we are all always already not only human, but materially intertwined with all that surrounds us. So how do we start to feel, to experience this truth? And how do we begin to feel our digital entanglement in the flesh so that we might theologize from it? Since for Pryor, digital theology must jump off from these moments of disorientation when the everyday becomes strange to us through our enfleshed experience of the digital. And yet, I have to ask, what exactly makes digital technologies qualitatively different or different in kind from other technologies? You use the decidedly non-digital technology of the bicycle to demonstrate the phenomenological interactions of the flesh, the way that my body does not end at the skin, but rather continuously remaps its boundaries to take up additional material and incorporate that material within its realm of experience. And I wish for more details about why the digital is so different. You have that citation of the John Durham Peters account of technological infrastructure. So it's infrastructure when it facilitates access to a depth of meaning while making the technology itself seem to disappear from our experience, if I understood that correctly. But again, doesn't this disappearance happen with any technology once we get sufficiently accustomed to it? Thinking of the highway hypnosis of the long-haul driver, or even the way I can get so absorbed in reading a book that I don't even hear my name being called. So is it only the massive proliferation of digital technology that makes it meaningfully different from analog technologies? You have that brief discussion of Zwift, the app with different virtual surroundings for stationary indoor bikes, but concluding that it's just a facsimile of real life experience. And I guess I kind of wanted more details about exactly why. And it did seem to me we had kind of a chopped off sentence, and I wondered if something kind of got eaten by the computer at that point that might have given us more information. But I also wonder about what might happen with a less immersive use of digital technology. For instance, an outdoor cyclist wearing an electronic fitness tracker, which may indeed intervene profoundly in her experience of time, space, and embodiment. Where does that fit in here? You have the suggestion that we need a, quote, typology of digital lived experiences that separate formation of the digital flesh into those that produce truly novel cosmic encounters with the world and digital facsimiles of real world experiences. But I wonder if it's really possible to make a definitive distinction between digital experiences of true novelty and those that are mere facsimiles. Even if I personally experience a given digital technology as merely a facsimile, can I universalize that experience, particularly when the facsimile may make certain experiences newly available to people who, because of disability, poverty, other material circumstances like a pandemic, they may never have the chance to have the real world experience. Furthermore, as we are increasingly recognizing that online is real life, does distinguishing between the truly novel digital experience and the digitized facsimile risk perpetuating and reifying an oversimplified dualism that reads the virtual as less material and less real, which I think is the opposite of what you're trying to do here. The point of this phenomenological account of enfleshed engagement with digital technologies is that such technologies are not less material, real, or fleshly, but differently material, real, and fleshly. So these are just some of the questions I was hoping to provoke further clarity and deeper engagement with this exciting proposal, which I think gives us a powerful way to think about doing like theology of the literally digital, the meeting place of the finger and the electronic device. Thank you.